give a sort of a broad picture, which perhaps we can elaborate later. One, I would like to make the point that the region of South Asia, which also, of course, was better known as the Indian subcontinent, rightly so. This is, to my mind, a single geopolitical unit. It is a single geo-economic unit. It is also, very importantly, a single ecological unit. It's an integrated ecological space. It is also a shared cultural space with a certain shared history. In every way, this is one can even call it a kind of a geopolitical singularity. And I think the main challenge is that, you cannot think in terms of security for South Asia without taking into account this nature of this region as one single geopolitical unit. But the reality is that this single space is divided into several independent sovereign states. It's a fragmented space. And I think the important thing to realize is that for countries in the region, threats that they perceive to their security, they do not see as coming from outside this space, but from inside the space. That is really the result of the great asymmetry of power that exists within this space. That is, you have India as an overwhelmingly powerful country, economically, militarily, which is much more than all the neighbors combined. So that's the aspect of asymmetry, which, in a sense, colors virtually everything that happens in this region. Now, let me make the point that if we are looking at, for example, when I talked about asymmetry, one is that almost all our neighbors share frontiers with India, but not with each other. So the country which is really the transit for all the countries in the region is India. We talk about, for example, transit through Bangladesh to our northeast, to further east into Myanmar, or we talk about Pakistan interrupting our connection with, say, Central Asia or the Gulf, that we do not have transit through these regions. But it is also a fact that India itself is perhaps the most difficult country in terms of transit. So if a container, for example, has to travel from, say, Dhaka, say, to Islamabad, then it has to, from Dhaka, maybe travel to Chittagong, then there is a transshipment, then it has to go right around, the peninsula of India, land at maybe Karachi, then again there is a transshipment, maybe onto the railway or to a truck, and then go to Islamabad. Calculations are that this takes a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks, plus the cost of all the transshipment which takes place. If, for example, using the existing transport network, if a container went from Dhaka on the railway network which still is there across the subcontinent to Karachi, it would take 3 days. And the cost would be a fraction of what they actually pay. So there is no trade which takes place as a result of that. My point is that this asymmetry, which creates almost naturally a sense of anxiety, a fear of domination amongst the countries around us, you have to take that as a given. So this business of, are we not loved by the neighbors, why is there so much hostility against India? I think we have to take into account that this kind of, sense of anxiety is something which is quite natural. We ourselves show that anxiety with respect to powers bigger than us, so it should not come as a surprise that our neighbors try to hedge against us. But in meeting this particular challenge, I believe that the very asymmetry that we are talking about of power is actually or can be made into a big asset for India. So, for example, with respect to how can India become a kind of engine of growth for the entire region? Because you are so large, because your economy is so large, even if all the things which are produced by our neighbors were actually given access to the Indian market, it would be a small fraction of the Indian market. But it would mean a great deal to our neighbors. Even if you look at, say, the transport networks, instead of telling Nepal that you can go only through this particular route and exit through Calcutta, and you don't have access to other routes through India, why do you need to do that? If you told your neighbors, you can use any transport artery in India that you want. You want to use the railways, you want to use the roadways, you want to use any port in India for your export and import. Again, in terms of the transport network that we have, would that really make much of a difference? It would be a very small volume of the total, cargo which is carried by our transport network. Point I am making is, can you present yourself as the preferred partner for your neighbors, rather than use the asymmetry as a means of leverage, as a kind of a coercive method, rather than as a method of putting across to neighbors that we can be a preferred partner. The reason why this is important is because we are no longer the only player in the region. Perhaps, in the early years of the independence, perhaps we could call this our backyard, and we could perhaps pursue India's version of a Monroe Doctrine. I'm afraid those days have changed. There are many more players in the region, and of course, the biggest one is China itself. And we bemoan the fact that China is making inroads into our region. Well, I always say, if you are going to leave spaces open, somebody will walk in. So this is something that I think is very important in terms of how do we look at our neighborhood policy. I certainly believe that for India, economic integration of South Asia is a huge plus. We sometimes think that the neighbors will gain much more from us rather than we from our neighbors. Don't forget that the largest surpluses that we have, trade surpluses we have, is in fact with our neighbors. The other aspect that is perhaps important is that, when India started adopting the economic reforms and liberalization program, looking at itself as integrating more and more with, for example, the very dynamic economic regions of Southeast Asia, of East Asia, looking at the globalization of the Indian economy, becoming a global player. I mean, that continues to be a major driver. However, in the early stages of this reform program, I used to be, in the Prime Minister's office at that time, and we were looking at this whole aspect of economic reforms and liberalization. There was a lot of opposition to it as well. But at that particular point of time, the prevailing sort of mood was, let's forget about these pesky neighbors that we have. We just need to sort of jump over them and integrate with Southeast Asia or East Asia. We should not be too bothered about the South Asian countries. And this was also the attitude towards SAARC, for example, that, this was like a ganging up of our smaller neighbors against India. Then this started changing. If you come to Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who went perhaps the furthest in envisioning a South Asia like a union, South Asia Union, He even spoke about a customs union. He spoke about a common currency for South Asia. He even spoke about a directly elected parliament for South Asia. I mean, of course, the model I think he had in mind was something like the European Union. But this is the vision that he presented. And I think that was born out of a realization since the reform and liberalization program began, that if India wanted actually to integrate with the wider Asian region, globally as well, the most important, shall I say, component of that integration is your own region. That is, if you're looking at concentric circles of collaboration, of integration, this is actually at the heart of that integrative process. And therefore, the attitude towards South Asia started changing. It would be fair to say that we have now come a full circle. That today, again, we are going back to a situation where we are again not looking at that integrative process with our neighborhood itself. We are again thinking in terms of the Southeast Asian and the East Asian region, the broader global integration. We are looking, of course, quite rightly towards the West as well, the Gulf, but also jumping over Pakistan. Pakistan is not part of that particular process. So I think this is something which requires a rethink, that we have to look at this particular region as being an indispensable component of any kind of regionalization or globalization that India is looking at as its future. So that's one important point I would like to make. The second important point, and I will end with this, is with regard to what I mentioned, the ecological integrity of South Asia. We share the mountains, we share the rivers, we share the sea around us. The weather patterns across South Asia the monsoon affects all the countries of the region. It is impossible to think in terms of any credible, any kind of a effective response to the climate emergency that we are facing, the ecological challenge that we are facing, without the kind of integration that I talked about. You cannot deal with the melting of the glaciers as India itself, even if you are the largest country, unless you have common collaborative responses. India, Nepal, Bhutan, even Pakistan, and later even one has to think about China's role in this respect. You cannot have any policy with regard to preventing this melting of glaciers. We think about all the rivers in the subcontinent. They are divided by political boundaries. However, rivers, like mountains, are living systems. You cannot chop them up as if they were pieces of property. So if you chop them up as pieces of property and only look at what is flowing through your sovereign territory, you cannot deal with the kind of challenges which you are facing, because for example, most of the rivers in the Indo-Gangetic Plain come through Nepal. What happens in Nepal very much impacts on the flow of the rivers in India. If there is heavy deforestation which takes place on the Nepali side, this does cause greater silting of the rivers as they enter into India. If we are looking at flood control, if we are looking at irrigation, if we are looking at even riverine transportation, which is something that the government is trying to promote, all this requires that the countries of the region who share these rivers manage these rivers together. Same thing with respect to the seas, because what we are finding is, if you take, for example, the Bay of Bengal, because of what is coming down from the upper reaches, from farmlands which are using huge amount of chemical fertilizers, using pesticides, massive use of plastics in these upper reaches. What has happened over the last several years is people perhaps do not realize that much of the Bay of Bengal is today what is called a maritime dead zone. That is, nothing living can be found in this particular zone. And there are several other regions where similar kind of thing is happening. So if we want to protect the seas around us, then also we have to have collaborative kind of responses. The rising of the sea levels, which will inevitably take place because of rising temperatures, melting of ice, for example, over the Antarctica or in the Arctic, all the coastal zones of the peninsula will be affected. All the island countries like the Maldives, Sri Lanka will be impacted. Large areas of Bangladesh will be inundated. Can we avoid large-scale migration of populations as a response? Do we have any plan for that? How do we look at these kind of emergency situations in the future? So if we are looking at this spectrum of challenges, frankly speaking, in the light of these challenges, all the political divisions which today seem to occupy us in South Asia, they will appear absolutely irrelevant. So this is something which requires somewhat broader kind of thinking if we have to deal with these challenges. Let me stop here. We are, of course, facing a difficult situation, as sometimes happens with the Maldives. You see them, in a change of government, asking the Indian government to withdraw the small contingent of forces that it has in the Maldives. We are perhaps somewhat reassured by the re-election of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, although I'm not quite sure how long that kind of relationship will continue. Bhutan, there are pressures from China. There may be some shifts in Bhutan's position as well. Nepal continues to be a bit of a question mark. Pakistan, and General Hasnain mentioned some of the security challenges which we face there. Let me say this, that I have a somewhat different view with respect to the opportunities which I see with respect to relations with Pakistan. If you see the period from 1960 onwards, still very recently, the one certainty that Pakistan was always able to leverage was that no matter what the state of relations between its two major patrons, the United States and China, never would you have found, even during the height of the Cultural Revolution, China ever objecting to American support and assistance, including military assistance to Pakistan. Even though Seato and Cento was supposedly directed against China. Never once will you see a reference in Chinese media objecting to what the Americans were doing with respect to Pakistan. Similarly, whatever be the tensions between China and the US, you will never find that the United States of America ever objected to Chinese support to Pakistan. So these two patrons, at least as far as support to Pakistan was concerned, were completely on the same page. What has happened recently is that geopolitical leverage which Pakistan has diminished, if not evaporated. So after the Americans went away from Afghanistan, their interest in this region, and therefore Pakistan as a conduit to Afghanistan, has diminished. Interestingly, recently when I was in China, with respect to China's support to Pakistan, you see today a certain frustration in China, even a kind of an impatience. I was told that there are security issues with respect to Chinese projects being done in Pakistan. There is a huge amount of corruption, of course, which is also affecting many of the Belt and Road projects. Don't forget that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was supposed to be the flagship project of the BRI. You don't hear that anymore. Pakistani expectation that once again their geopolitical location and leverage would enable them to overcome whatever economic crisis they face, as they have done in the past, that has also proved to be wrong. So Pakistan is today in a really very difficult position. Even the support from the Gulf kingdoms like Saudi Arabia has diminished. So there is a certain kind of a change, major change in the geopolitical map here. Look at what has happened with Afghanistan. Today, for Pakistan, the more difficult border is not the India-Pakistan border, but it is the Pakistan-Afghan border. Forget about strategic depth. No strategic depth is there. It is actually today a very challenging situation for Pakistan. So for me, this is actually an opportunity not to establish friendly relations with Pakistan, but at least to establish a certain manageable relationship with Pakistan. I think it would give us a certain geopolitical boost that we need at this particular point of time. So in looking at our neighborhood, perhaps not only looking at the threat aspect, which we always highlight, I think we should also look at the opportunity aspect, which are much neglected. Thank you very much for your attention.